I want to ask you about this saturated fat thing because sometimes I have these, let's call them heated discussions in the comment section with people who seem to be convinced that saturated fat and LDL is good for the body. Where do these people come from? Where are they getting this information? And does that have some sort of leg to stand on? Like, surely it's not just poof, it's just made up. There has to be somewhere that this came from.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's two things. Let's touch LDL first. So LDL cholesterol, it causes heart disease, causes atherosclerosis. We know that. We have data from genetic studies, from cohort studies, from randomized controlled trials. We know that that's the case. So this idea that low cholesterol or low LDL is actually bad for you and that you want to have it higher actually comes from data on elderly populations. So when we look at older populations, and we look at their LDL levels, there's a lot of times where actually lower LDL levels will signify worse health, and they'll actually have higher mortality rates. The reason that is because as you get sick, if you end up with cancer or other diseases, your LDL can actually drop. So they're sick, causing their LDL to drop, and then obviously the low LDL is going to be associated with poorer health outcomes. But it's not the low LDL causing the health issue, and that's where they mess up. Now we have multiple Mendelian randomization experiments. This is looking at genetically determined LDL levels. And we find that actually lower LDL is associated with greater longevity, higher LDL, earlier death. And so that should really be the final nail in the coffin, because that's lifelong. That's not considering that, later in life you get sick, your LDL drops. We're like, no, lifelong from birth till death, your LDLs are lower and you tend to do better. So that kind of gets rid of that issue. The saturated fat one, I mean, there's a few angles that people take with this. There are some studies that do something called an over adjustment. So if you look at saturated fat consumption and heart disease risk, for example, we know that saturated fat raises your LDL cholesterol, and then higher LDL, like I just said, causes heart disease. Well, they'll do this adjustment for LDL. So they'll actually match people up essentially based on their LDL levels. So they'll look at people eating more or less saturated fat with the same LDL. And now everyone's going to have genetic differences. So that kind of eliminates the impact of saturated fat on your LDL, right? If A leads to B and B leads to C, but you just remove B as a variable altogether, you're never going to find that connection between A and C. And so that's a big issue that comes up in a lot of the research actually that's commonly cited there. And then the last one, there's a couple trials done on saturated fats versus like polyunsaturated fats, normally found in either vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, and those sorts of things, where they actually found possibly worse outcomes for the polyunsaturated fats. However, these were a couple trials done in like the 60s and 70s where they were using margarines that were full of trans fats. And that was before we knew a ton about trans fats. And so if you're replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fats, but these polyunsaturated fats just happen to come packaged with all this trans fat, that's obviously going to lead to worse outcomes, because trans fats are even worse than saturated fats. So that's really where all of that, or almost all of that confusion comes from, is from those few issues.